The sun rises over a land kissed by two mighty rivers, their waters winding through a dry, unforgiving plain. It is here, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that life first dared to bloom against the odds. This is no ordinary land. This is the cradle where human civilization took its first breath, where fragile hopes of survival turned into enduring legacies. Every grain of soil, every drop of water carries the weight of an ancient story, whispered by the winds across thousands of years. The rivers themselves are a marvel. The Tigris rushes fast and strong, cutting through the earth with relentless energy, while the Euphrates flows wider and slower, almost as if pausing to nourish every patch of land it touches. Together, they shape the landscape into a rich and fertile crescent, an oasis of green amid the arid expanse that surrounds it. The land, soaked with their generosity, offers a lifeline. It's as if nature itself recognized this place as special, a stage set for something extraordinary. Long before cities and kings, before written words and carved monuments, this land was a haven for wandering bands of humans. Small groups, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons, stumbled upon the bounty provided by these rivers. Wild grains grew in abundance, and animals gathered to drink, their tracks etched into the mud like nature's invitation. Here, people paused. They stopped their endless wandering, looked around, and began to plant roots, literally and figuratively. The soil, enriched by seasonal floods, was unlike any other. It smelled of possibility, dark and fertile, promising harvests that could sustain not just individuals but entire communities. Water, so often a scarce and unpredictable resource, was suddenly abundant. But this gift came with its challenges. The rivers could be fierce, rising unexpectedly to flood fields, destroying crops, and forcing people to start over. It wasn't easy, but there was no turning away. The people who lived here learned to tame the waters, digging channels and ditches to guide them. It was a labor of survival, of necessity, but also of vision. These efforts marked the beginning of something new: cooperation, ingenuity, and the first glimmers of society. The land, though generous, was far from idyllic. Summers were blisteringly hot, with the sun pounding down mercilessly, turning the ground into cracked, parched clay. Winters brought biting winds that howled across the plains. Yet, through these extremes, life persisted. The rivers never stopped flowing, their waters cutting through the monotony of the barren landscape, a reminder that sustenance was always within reach. The early settlers learned to adapt. They became masters of their environment, coaxing life from the earth with grit and determination. Slowly, over generations, their efforts bore fruit. Small settlements grew, scattered like seeds along the river's banks. Mud brick houses rose from the earth, humble but sturdy, each one a testament to resilience. Families gathered around fires, sharing food harvested from the land, telling stories under starlit skies. These were the beginnings of community, the first faint hum of civilization. The rivers didn't just provide water, they connected people. Boats crafted from reeds began to glide along the waters, carrying goods and ideas. Trade emerged, and with it, the threads of a shared culture. People exchanged more than tools and pottery, they shared dreams, knowledge, and traditions. The rivers became arteries of life, linking one settlement to another, creating a network that stretched across the Fertile Crescent. Nature's generosity extended beyond the soil and water. This land was rich in other ways too. The hills offered clay for pottery and bricks, while the plains yielded reeds for building and writing. Dates hung heavy from palm trees, their sweetness a rare comfort in a harsh world. But life wasn't without hardships. Metal was scarce, and timber was precious, forcing the people to look outward, forging relationships with neighboring lands to obtain what they couldn't produce. Every resource had to be earned, every challenge overcome with creativity and persistence. And still, they endured. The rhythms of the rivers became the rhythms of life. People marked time not by clocks, but by the rising and falling of the waters, the planting and harvesting of crops. The rivers dictated everything, shaping not just the land, but the people themselves. Over time, they grew to see the rivers as more than just physical entities. They became sacred, divine, symbols of life and renewal. Their names carried weight, spoken with reverence, etched into the stories passed down from one generation to the next. In this land of contrasts, where abundance met adversity, where the generosity of nature was matched only by its ferocity, something remarkable began to happen. People began to imagine a world bigger than themselves, bigger than their villages. They started to shape their environment not just to survive, but to thrive. The rivers, the land, the skies, they became more than elements of the natural world. They became the foundation of something greater, the birthplace of innovation, culture, and civilization. And so, the land between the rivers stood as a beacon, its fields and waters shimmering with potential. It wasn't the easiest place to live, but it was a place worth fighting for, a place where humanity took its first steps toward building a legacy that would outlast the rise and fall of empires. The story of this land, of these rivers, was just beginning. The earth was silent, except for the rustle of the wind and the soft crunch of feet on dry grass. A group of people moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Their lives depended on this vigilance. Every step was a choice, every direction a gamble. For as long as they could remember, survival had been a relentless chase, following the herds, gathering what the wild offered, and hoping the seasons would be kind. But one day, something shifted. Someone noticed the way seeds spilled from their hands, scattering onto the ground, and weeks later, sprouted into green shoots. It was a simple observation, but it carried the weight of a revelation. What if food didn't have to be searched for endlessly? What if it could grow where they stood? This idea, so small at first, was the spark that changed everything. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming was not sudden, nor was it easy. It began with small experiments, tentative attempts to plant grains and watch them grow. The fields, once wild and untamed, became places of hope and labor. Hands, once used to wielding spears, now turned the soil, feeling its warmth and potential. For the first time, people began to shape their surroundings, coaxing life from the earth in a way that felt both miraculous and terrifying. But nature was unpredictable. Rain didn't always come when it was needed, and when it did, it often came too much, flooding the fragile patches of crops. This struggle against the elements taught people something else. They couldn't just rely on chance. They needed to take control. And so, they began digging. Channels carved into the earth directed water to where it was needed, and ditches protected fields from flooding. These early efforts in irrigation were not merely acts of survival, they were acts of faith. Every canal, every embankment spoke of a belief that the land could be tamed, that life could be made more secure. With time, the fields began to yield more than just enough to survive. There was food to save for later, food to share, food to trade. For the first time, there was a surplus, a word that carried the promise of a future no longer defined by hunger. With this abundance, life began to change. People no longer needed to wander endlessly in search of sustenance. They built homes, simple at first, but strong enough to shelter them through the seasons. Villages began to rise, clusters of houses where families gathered, where children played, and where communities formed. Jericho was one of these places. Its walls, built from stone and mud, stood as silent witnesses to this transformation. Inside, life was vibrant and full of possibilities. People wove baskets to carry their harvests, crafted tools to till the soil, and made pottery to store their grains. There was laughter, celebration, and the sharing of stories around firelight. These villages, small as they were, marked the beginnings of a new way of life, one that seemed to defy the uncertainty of the past. Farther away, in a place called Catalhoyuk, another settlement thrived. The houses there were built so close together that people walked on rooftops to move through the village. Inside, walls were adorned with paintings, scenes of animals, hunters, and life itself. These images told stories of who they were and what they valued. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about meaning, about leaving a mark. The people of Catalhoyuk were not just living, they were creating, imagining, and dreaming of a world beyond the struggles of daily life. But the shift to agriculture and settled life was not without its cost. The land, once abundant and forgiving, demanded care and attention. Fields had to be planted, watered, and guarded against pests. The seasons, though predictable, brought their own challenges: droughts that withered crops, storms that destroyed homes. Settling down also meant new risks. Disease spread more easily when people lived close together, and disputes arose over land and resources. Yet, through all this, the people persevered. The fields of grain waving in the wind, the fruits hanging from carefully tended trees, were worth the struggle. The lives of these early farmers were a mixture of toil and wonder. Every sunrise brought with it the promise of growth, the thrill of seeing a sprout push through the soil, the satisfaction of a harvest well earned. Children ran through the fields, their laughter mingling with the hum of insects. At night, families gathered under the stars, their bellies full, their hearts grateful for the land that sustained them. From these first villages, the seeds of something greater were planted, not just in the soil, but in the hearts of the people. They began to see themselves not as wanderers, at the mercy of the wild, but as stewards of the land. Their hands, calloused from work, had shaped a new world, one where the future was no longer uncertain, but something they could build, day by day, season by season. The fields became their legacy, the rivers their lifeline, and the land their home. The sun beat down on the endless plain, its heat radiating off the cracked earth. But in the distance, something remarkable caught the eye. It wasn't a natural hill or a simple cluster of huts. It was something far more deliberate: homes made of mud brick, their walls standing firm against the unforgiving winds. Around them, fields stretched wide, and canals snaked through the landscape, carrying life-giving water to the crops. This was no ordinary village. It was a place where humanity had begun to dream of permanence, stability, and something greater than survival. The people of this place, what we now call the Abade culture, were building more than just homes. They were shaping a way of life that would echo through the ages. Their pottery, simple yet elegant, told a story of careful craftsmanship and pride. The hands that molded the clay were steady, practiced, creating vessels that carried not just food and water but the essence of a burgeoning civilization. Each piece was unique, painted with patterns that whispered of the shared rhythms of life, the sowing of seeds, the harvest, the celebrations of plenty. But it wasn't just their pottery that set them apart. For the first time, people began to think beyond their immediate needs. They built not just for themselves, but for their communities. At the heart of their settlements rose structures that commanded attention: temples. These were not grand like the ziggurats that would come later, but they were significant. Made of mud brick, these temples stood as symbols of unity, of shared purpose. They were places where people gathered, not just to worship but to plan, to work together, to build something enduring. The temple wasn't just a house for the gods, it was the beating heart of the community. From within its walls, decisions were made about food, labor, and trade. People brought their offerings, humble gifts of grain or livestock, hoping for blessings in return. The priests, who oversaw these rituals, held a unique power. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they were organizers, managers of resources, and the keepers of knowledge. Under their guidance, the economy of these early cities began to flourish. Life in these communities was a delicate balance. Each person had a role to play, and together, they formed a web of interdependence. Farmers tilled the soil, their backs bent under the weight of the sun, trusting that the temple would store their surplus grain for times of need. Potters worked by the riverbanks, shaping clay into jars that would carry water or hold food. Fishermen cast their nets into the rivers, their catches feeding not just their families but the entire community. And above it all, the temple stood, its smoke rising to the heavens, a promise of order in a chaotic world. The Abade people were not just building cities, they were building ideas. They began to imagine a world governed by rules and shared beliefs. The gods they worshipped weren't distant or abstract, they were woven into the fabric of daily life. There was a god for the rivers, whose waters brought both life and destruction. A god for the fields, whose blessings ensured the harvest. And a god for the sky, whose storms could make or break the seasons. These deities were not just sources of awe and fear, they were partners in survival, beings to be honored and appeased. As these beliefs took root, so did the foundations of governance. The temples were not just religious centers, they were hubs of authority. Decisions about who planted where, who got what, and how much was owed to the gods were made here. The priests, with their knowledge of the cycles of the moon and the seasons, became the first administrators. Their power was built not on force but on trust, on the belief that they spoke for the gods and acted for the good of all. Architecture, too, began to reflect this growing complexity. Homes were no longer simple shelters but places designed for families, for storage, for comfort. Streets wound between these houses, paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. And in the center of it all, the temple rose, its platform raised as if reaching toward the heavens. It wasn't the height or grandeur that mattered, it was the idea behind it. This was a place where earth and sky met, where the divine touched the mortal. But the people of the Ubaid culture weren't just looking inward, they were looking outward, too. They traded with distant lands, their pottery and tools finding their way to other settlements. These exchanges brought not just goods but ideas, weaving a web of connection that stretched far beyond the plains of Mesopotamia. The seeds of cooperation, of mutual benefit, were sown alongside the crops. The air in these early cities buzzed with the energy of possibility. Children ran through the streets, their laughter mixing with the sounds of work, the pounding of clay, the rustle of reeds being woven into baskets, the steady rhythm of grinding grain. There was hard work, yes, but there was also hope, a sense that something new and extraordinary was being created. These people, who had once lived in scattered villages, were now part of something much bigger. They were not just surviving, they were thriving, dreaming, and building a legacy. In the quiet moments, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields glowed golden in its light, the people must have felt it, that they were part of something enduring. The walls of their homes, the temples they built, the fields they tended, all of it was for more than just today. It was for the future, for the generations that would come after them. They were laying the first stones of a civilization that would shape the world. And though they could not have known it, their work, their dreams, their faith would echo through the ages, carried on the winds that swept across the land between the rivers. The air was heavy with the hum of life. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic pounding of a mallet against stone echoed across the plain. Closer by, the murmur of voices rose and fell, blending with the occasional bray of donkeys and the shuffle of countless feet along dusty streets. This was not a quiet village or a scattered settlement. This was Uruk, a city so alive, so immense, it felt like the beating heart of the world itself. The walls of Uruk towered above the land, immense and imposing, their mud brick surface glowing under the scorching sun. These walls, legends would later say, were built by the hands of Gilgamesh, a king whose name would echo through time. But the city behind them was even more astonishing. Streets teemed with people, farmers, traders, potters, and scribes, each going about their tasks with purpose. It was a place of creation and innovation, of dreams made real in clay and stone. At the city's core stood the great temple complexes, rising above the chaos of daily life. These ziggurats, built in honor of the gods, seemed to stretch toward the heavens. Their steps were worn smooth by the feet of worshippers who climbed them to leave offerings or to pray for rain, for health, for the favor of deities who watched over the land. Within their shadow, the city buzzed with activity. Markets sprawled in open spaces, their stalls laden with grains, textiles, and intricately crafted goods. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the sharper tang of copper being smelted into tools. But it was not just the grandeur of Uruk that set it apart, it was what its people did here, what they invented. In a quiet corner of the city, a group of men and women sat cross-legged on the ground, their hands busy with reeds and clay tablets. They weren't making art or tools, they were shaping symbols, lines, and marks into wet clay. These were not idle scratches. They were words, ideas captured for the first time in history. Writing had been born. Cuneiform, they called it, a script of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay. At first, it was simple, used to keep track of grain stored in the temple or sheep sent to trade. But soon, these marks began to carry more than numbers. They told stories, recorded laws, and captured prayers. the world of Uruk expanded beyond what could be spoken aloud. Words, once ephemeral, now had weight and permanence, preserved in the cool, hardened clay. Writing changed everything. The farmer who delivered sacks of barley to the temple no longer relied on memory or trust alone. A scribe's tablet, marked with precise symbols, ensured his work was acknowledged. Agreements became contracts. Histories became chronicles. Knowledge could now be passed down, not just from one person to another, but across generations. The invention of writing turned the intangible into something real, something lasting. It was like opening a door to a future no one had dared to imagine. Yet the city's greatness did not rest on writing alone. Uruk's people were builders and thinkers, traders and craftsmen. They looked beyond their walls and saw a world full of opportunities. Their fields, irrigated with water drawn from the Euphrates, yielded harvests so abundant they could feed not just their own but others as well. Surplus grain was loaded onto boats that glided down the rivers, bound for distant lands. The people of Uruk traded barley and textiles for the precious resources their land lacked: timber from the mountains, metals from far-off mines, and exotic goods that spoke of lands beyond the horizon. This exchange wasn't just about goods. It was about connection. The rivers carried more than cargo, they carried ideas. From the highlands of Anatolia to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, trade routes became lifelines of innovation. The wheel, crafted first for pottery, was adapted for carts, revolutionizing transport. Metallurgy advanced, and the soft glow of copper began to mingle with the sharper sheen of bronze. Tools became sharper, stronger, more reliable. Life became easier, more efficient, more ambitious. Uruk was a place of firsts. The first city-state, with its own government, its own economy, its own culture. The first monumental architecture that seemed to challenge the heavens. The first writing, turning thoughts into marks that outlived their makers. And with these firsts came something profound, the sense that humanity was capable of not just surviving but creating. The people of Uruk were building a world that was bigger, richer, and more complex than anything that had come before. But amidst the progress and the noise, life in Uruk was still deeply human. The weaver, bent over her loom, hummed a tune as her hands worked the threads into patterns her mother had taught her. The merchant, haggling over the price of dates, laughed as he made his final offer. A child, barefoot and curious, splashed in a puddle left by the morning's canal water, oblivious to the importance of the city around her. These moments, mundane, fleeting, were the true pulse of Uruk, the quiet rhythm that sustained its greatness. As the sun set over the city, its golden light bathed the walls and the ziggurats in a warm glow. The streets, bustling just moments ago, began to quiet. Families gathered in their homes, sharing meals and stories. The scribe put away his tools, his clay tablets now hardened and safe. The farmer, weary from a day in the fields, looked toward the temple, his thoughts a silent prayer of gratitude. And above it all, the stars began to appear, twinkling faintly in the vast Mesopotamian sky. Uruk was more than a city. It was a testament to what humanity could achieve when united by purpose, driven by imagination, and guided by faith. Its walls held not just people but dreams, the dreams of those who dared to build, to invent, to write their place into the fabric of history. And those dreams, born in the dust of its streets, would never fade. The sun climbed steadily over the plains of Sumer, casting its golden light across the sprawling city. At the heart of it stood a structure that defied the flat horizon, a towering ziggurat that seemed to touch the heavens. Its steep sides rose tier by tier, each level painted with care, shimmering in hues that caught the sun. The steps leading upward were worn smooth by countless feet, pilgrims ascending with offerings, their hearts heavy with hopes and prayers. This was no mere building. It was the soul of the city, the bridge between earth and sky, where gods and mortals met. Below the shadow of the ziggurat, the city bustled with life. Streets twisted through neighborhoods where traders shouted, children laughed, and the clang of metal echoed from workshops. But above all this vibrant activity was a delicate order, a hierarchy that governed every aspect of life. The city-states of Sumer were like jewels scattered across the land, each with its own ruler, its own patron god, and its own identity. Yet, they all shared one truth: the gods were at the center of everything. The kings of Sumer were not just rulers, they were chosen by the gods themselves, or so the people believed. Their power came not from might alone, but from divine favor. The word for king, Lugal, meant great man, but his greatness was not his own. The gods had bestowed it upon him, and with it came immense responsibility. A king was a shepherd, guiding his people, protecting them from enemies, and ensuring the temples were maintained. His crown, his scepter, his very presence, all were symbols of a covenant between the divine and the mortal world. But the king was not alone in his duties. The priests, cloaked in robes of fine linen, held sway over the spiritual and the practical. They were the interpreters of the gods' will, reading omens in the stars, the liver of a sacrificial animal, or the patterns in the smoke of burning incense. The temple was their domain, and within its walls, they oversaw the complex machinery of a theocratic society. It was here that offerings of grain, oil, and livestock were received, recorded, and redistributed. It was here that the gods were honored, their favor secured through ritual and devotion. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was an economic powerhouse, a hub of administration, and a storehouse of resources. The granaries within its precincts overflowed with the harvests of the surrounding fields, brought as tithes or offerings. Artisans worked in its workshops, crafting pottery, textiles, and tools for the temple and the city. Scribes, seated cross-legged on the floor, meticulously recorded every transaction, every gift to the gods, every laborer's task. The temple was the heart of the city-state, its pulse felt in every corner of life. And at the center of the temple complex rose the ziggurat, a structure so grand it seemed impossible that human hands had built it. Its design was as practical as it was symbolic. The high platform protected the shrine at its peak from the floods that sometimes swept the plains. But more importantly, it brought the gods closer to the people, or so they believed. Climbing the ziggurat steps was not merely an act of ascent, it was a spiritual journey, each level a step closer to the heavens. The ziggurat was built with a precision and artistry that spoke of the Sumerians' ingenuity. Thousands of bricks, each carefully molded from the clay of the rivers, were stacked in perfect alignment. The outer layers were baked to withstand the elements, while the core was made of sun-dried brick. The construction was a communal effort, a testament to the city's unity and faith. Every brick laid was a prayer, every level completed an act of devotion. Below the sacred shrine at its summit, life unfolded with the steady rhythm of ritual. The priests performed ceremonies to honor the gods, their chants rising like a hum that filled the air. Fires burned on altars, their smoke carrying offerings to the heavens. The people watched from below, their faces turned upward, their hearts full of reverence. For them, the ziggurat was more than stone and mortar. It was a living symbol of their connection to the divine, a reminder that they were part of a greater story. Yet, life in the shadow of the ziggurat was not without its struggles. The king, for all his power, faced constant challenges. Rival city-states vied for dominance, their armies clashing on the open plains. The rivers, so vital to life, sometimes betrayed their people, flooding fields or drying up when rain did not come. Famine and disease were never far from thought, and the gods' favor could seem fleeting and uncertain. But even in the face of these trials, the Sumerians endured. They found strength in their belief that the gods were watching, that their kings were chosen, that their cities were sanctuaries of order in a chaotic world. The ziggurat, towering above all, stood as a promise that no matter how hard life became, they were not alone. Their labor, their faith, their sacrifices, they all meant something. At night, when the city quieted, the ziggurat stood bathed in the silvery glow of the moon. Its shadow stretched long across the sleeping city, touching every home, every street. The stars above glittered like jewels, their patterns familiar to the priests who watched them, searching for signs of what the gods intended. In those moments, the city seemed to breathe as one, its people united by the towering presence that reminded them of their shared purpose, their shared destiny. The Sumerians' world was a tapestry of faith and power, woven together by the hands of kings and priests, shaped by the rise of ziggurats that touched the heavens. Their achievements were not merely acts of survival, they were acts of defiance against the chaos of the world. They built, they worshipped, they governed, and in doing so, they left a legacy as enduring as the bricks of their ziggurats, as timeless as the stars that watched over them. Beneath the vast and open skies of Sumer, where the stars seemed to whisper stories as old as time, a tale unfolded, a tale so powerful it carved itself into clay, outliving kings and temples, rivers and cities. The Epic of Gilgamesh was more than just a story, it was a mirror of the Sumerian soul, a reflection of their fears, their hopes, their search for meaning in a world ruled by gods and fate. The epic began in Uruk, the city with towering walls, where Gilgamesh reigned as king. He was no ordinary man. 2/3 god and 1/3 mortal, he was a figure of immense strength and unmatched arrogance. His power was undeniable, but his heart was restless. The people of Uruk whispered prayers, begging the gods to intervene. And intervene they did. In the wilderness, they created Enkidu, a wild man, as strong and fierce as Gilgamesh himself. The clash between the two was inevitable. But what began as a battle turned into the deepest of friendships. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu challenged the gods and the world they had made. They killed the bull of heaven, defying divine wrath, and ventured into the cedar forest, facing its guardian, Humbaba. These weren't just adventures, they were confrontations with the unknown, the eternal human desire to push boundaries, to leave a mark. But the gods could not be defied without consequence. Enkidu's death, a punishment for their defiance, shattered Gilgamesh. His grief was boundless, his sorrow a raw wound that bled into the heart of the story. In Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh confronted the shadow that loomed over every Sumerian life, mortality. The epic became a journey of questions, a desperate search for immortality, not through divine power but through understanding. When Gilgamesh met Utnapishtim, the man granted eternal life after surviving a great flood, he hoped to find the answer. But Utnapishtim's tale was not of triumph. It was a story of survival, of the gods' wrath, of a fleeting reprieve from the inevitable. Gilgamesh learned that immortality was not the gift he sought. The real lesson was acceptance, to live fully in the brief moment given to humans. This story was not just about a king or his adventures. It was a hymn to Sumerian life, their beliefs, their understanding of the cosmos. The gods of Sumer were not distant creators, they were woven into the fabric of existence. Anu, Enlil, Inanna, Enki, they governed the wind, the rain, the stars. They were forces of nature and arbiters of human fate. The Sumerians lived at their mercy, offering prayers and sacrifices to seek favor or to ward off disaster. The myths of the gods were not idle stories, they explained the unexplainable. The cycle of life and death, the flooding rivers, the fertility of the fields, all were tied to divine will. Inanna's descent into the underworld told of seasons, of death and rebirth. The creation myths spoke of the gods' labor and their decision to create humans as workers, to relieve themselves of toil. Life itself was a delicate balance between serving the gods and finding joy in their blessings. But even as they honored their gods, the Sumerians were a people of astonishing creativity. Their fields stretched wide, nourished by irrigation canals that shimmered in the sun. Agriculture was their lifeblood, and their connection to the land was intimate and profound. Farmers rose with the first light, their hands thick with calluses, their backs bent from planting barley and wheat. Their work was sacred, a continuation of the cosmic order set by the gods. In the cities, artists and craftsmen brought beauty to life. Their hands molded clay into vessels, carved stone into intricate designs, and wove textiles dyed in vibrant colors. Art wasn't merely decorative, it was a language, speaking of the divine, of power, of human experience. The walls of temples were adorned with images of gods and kings, their forms stylized but filled with meaning. Even everyday objects, a drinking cup or a spindle, carried traces of the Sumerian skill and care. Law, too, was a cornerstone of their civilization. Kings and priests, guided by divine authority, established codes that governed daily life. Justice was not arbitrary, it was seen as a reflection of the gods' order. From disputes over land to the punishment of theft, the laws were etched into clay, ensuring that the community functioned in harmony. The people understood their place in this structure, bound by rules that were as much spiritual as they were practical. Life in Sumer was not easy, but it was filled with moments of profound beauty and meaning. A farmer watching the sunrise over his fields, a mother weaving a blanket for her child, a scribe recording the harvest on a clay tablet, all these moments spoke of a culture deeply connected to its world. The Sumerians lived with an acute awareness of life's fragility, but they also knew how to celebrate its richness. The Epic of Gilgamesh captured all of this. It wasn't just a tale of a king's quest, it was a meditation on what it meant to be human. In its lines, one could hear the echo of Sumerian voices, their laughter, their tears, their prayers to gods who both blessed and cursed them. It told of their triumphs and failures, their love and loss, their courage in the face of the unknown. As Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, his heart heavy with the knowledge he could never escape death, he looked upon his city. He saw the walls that he had built, strong and enduring. And in those walls, he found his answer. Immortality was not in the body, but in what one left behind, in the stories, in the works, in the city itself. The Sumerians understood this deeply. Their lives were fleeting, but their legacy was eternal. In their myths, their art, their laws, and their fields, they left behind a testament to the beauty and complexity of human existence. Their world may have vanished, but their story, like the epic of their greatest king, endures. The sound of marching feet echoed across the open plains of Mesopotamia, a rhythm that struck fear into hearts and kindled flames of ambition in others. At the head of this great force stood a man who was more than a king. He was a symbol of power, a legend in his own time. Sargon, the ruler of Akkad, had transformed himself from a humble cupbearer into the master of an empire. His name would not only echo in the halls of his capital, but ripple through the ages, marking the dawn of something entirely new, the world's first empire. Sargon was not born to power. His origins were humble, his story one of audacity and determination. Raised in obscurity, his youth was spent serving others, a life far removed from the splendor that awaited him. But within him burned a fire that refused to be extinguished. When the moment came, he seized it with both hands, overthrowing his master, Lugal-Zagizi, and setting his sights on something greater than any city-state could offer. He would unite the fractured lands of Mesopotamia, not through the divine blessings of the temples, but through sheer will and force of arms. Under his leadership, the Akkadian army became a force that would redefine warfare. Disciplined and relentless, they moved like a tidal wave, crushing resistance and spreading Akkadian banners across the land. Sargon's victories were not just battles won, they were statements. Each conquest declared that Akkad was not a passing storm but a new order, one that demanded obedience and loyalty from the farthest reaches of the Fertile Crescent. The cities of Sumer, once proud and independent, bowed before him. Their kings were stripped of their titles, their gods incorporated into the Akkadian pantheon. Sargon understood that military strength alone would not hold his empire together. He wielded more than swords, he wielded ideas. By blending the cultural and religious practices of his subjects, he created a sense of unity that transcended the borders of language and tradition. The gods of Akkad and Sumer shared temples, and the names of rulers were inscribed in multiple languages on stone steels. It was a delicate balance, but one that worked, at least for a time. The administration of the Akkadian Empire was a marvel of efficiency. Sargon's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, a vast territory that required more than brute strength to govern. He established a network of governors, each responsible for a region, and these officials were loyal not to their own cities but to Akkad. Roads connected the far-flung provinces, and messages carried by couriers ensured that the king's will was known even in the most distant corners. Trade flourished, with goods flowing through the empire like blood through veins, timber from the mountains, precious metals from Anatolia, and spices from lands farther still. But this empire, like all things, bore its fragility within. After decades of unparalleled success, cracks began to form in the foundations that Sargon had so carefully laid. His successors, though mighty, could not match his genius for leadership. Rebellions flared like sparks in dry grass, and the empire's vast size made it difficult to quell them all. Nature itself seemed to conspire against Akkad, as droughts weakened harvests and strained the resources needed to sustain such a sprawling realm. The city of Akkad, once the jewel of the empire, faced its darkest days. By the time of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, the empire was in decline. Naram-Sin declared himself a god, an act of hubris that alienated many of his subjects. His reign saw fierce resistance and invasions from the Gutians, a people who descended from the eastern mountains like shadows, sowing chaos in their wake. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first, began to falter under the weight of its own ambitions. Even as the empire crumbled, its legacy refused to fade. Sargon's vision had transformed Mesopotamia, and the echoes of his reign could be felt in every stone city and every written tablet. The Akkadians had shown the world that a single ruler could govern a vast and diverse land, that unity was possible even among people of different tongues and traditions. Their innovations in administration, military strategy, and culture would inspire the empires that followed, from Babylon to Assyria. The land that had once trembled beneath Sargon's feet slowly returned to its fractured state, city-states rising and falling like waves on a restless sea. But his name endured, spoken with awe and reverence, a reminder that even in a world of chaos, a single vision could change everything. The Akkadian Empire, though fleeting, had carved its mark into the history of humanity, a mark that would never truly fade. The sun rose over the plains of Sumer, its golden light spreading across the ziggurats and the bustling streets of Ur. It was not just another day, it was a moment in history when hope stirred anew, and a once-fractured land dared to dream of greatness again. Ur-Nammu stood at the heart of this awakening, a king who did not just rule but rebuilt a world from the ruins left behind by invaders and time. Under his guidance, the dynasty of Ur-3 rose like a phoenix, breathing life into a land scarred by chaos and despair. Ur-Nammu's ascent was a story of resilience. The Gutians, who had roamed the lands as conquerors, left behind only ruin. Sumer's temples were quiet, its fields neglected, its people burdened by hunger and fear. But Ur-Nammu looked upon this shattered land and saw what it could be. With strength and vision, he united Sumer under his banner, restoring its cities and its spirit. The walls of Ur were raised higher than before, a symbol of protection and pride. Its streets buzzed with activity, merchants and craftsmen weaving a tapestry of life that spoke of recovery and ambition. Under his rule, the people found more than just security. Ur-Nammu gave them order. He crafted one of the world's first codified sets of laws, etched into clay tablets to be seen and understood by all. These laws did more than settle disputes, they reminded people of fairness and justice. They spoke of an ideal where even kings were bound by the rules of the land, where life's unpredictability could be tamed by the steady hand of governance. The farmer knew his rights, the merchant understood his duties, and the laborer found protection in the words inscribed for eternity. Ur-Nammu's reforms reached every corner of life. He rebuilt the canals that carried water to parched fields, ensuring the crops would flourish and the people would never again face the specter of famine. Grain storage became systematic, and trade blossomed once more. From the mountains of Anatolia came precious metals, from the Indus Valley, vibrant goods that spoke of lands far away. Every transaction added to the strength of Ur-3, turning the city into a beacon of prosperity. At the heart of this resurgence stood the ziggurat, rising high into the heavens as if reaching for the gods themselves. Ur-Nammu's greatest architectural triumph, the ziggurat of Ur, was not just a building, it was a statement. Layer upon layer, the structure climbed, its walls shimmering in the sunlight. Priests ascended its steps with offerings, their prayers mingling with the whispers of the wind. The ziggurat was both a tribute and a bridge, a reminder of humanity's connection to the divine, even as it stood grounded in the dust of the earth. The dynasty of Ur-3 was not just about grand achievements, it was also about the daily lives of its people. Farmers toiled in the fields, their hands working the soil that gave them life. Artisans shaped clay and metal into objects of both utility and beauty. Scribes sat hunched over their tablets, recording transactions, laws, and poetry that would echo through the ages. Women and men alike played roles in this intricate society, their contributions forming the threads of a vibrant culture. Life was hard, but it was full, and it carried a rhythm that spoke of hope and determination. But no dynasty, no matter how strong, is immune to the forces of time and fortune. As the years passed, the strength that had defined UR3 began to waver. The demands of an empire stretched across vast lands became too great. Resources dwindled, and the administration that had once brought order began to falter. Enemies at the borders grew bolder, sensing weakness in the cracks that had begun to form. The Amorites and Elamites loomed on the horizon, their presence a shadow over the land. UR's walls, though mighty, could not withstand forever the relentless pressure of those who sought to take what had been built. Internal dissent simmered as well. The unity that had once defined UR3 fractured under the weight of famine and discontent. The gods, who had once been seen as protectors, now seemed silent. In the final days of UR3, the ziggurat still stood tall, its steps worn by countless feet, its walls witness to both glory and despair. The people of Sumer looked to their leaders, to their gods, to the skies, searching for answers as their world began to crumble around them. The city that had been a symbol of resurgence now stood on the brink, its future uncertain. Yet even as UR3 fell, its legacy could not be erased. The vision of Ur-Nammu, the laws he inscribed, the structures he raised, and the culture he nurtured endured in the hearts and minds of those who came after. The dust may have settled on the stones of Ur, but its spirit lived on, a testament to what humanity can achieve even in the face of adversity. A figure stood before the great gates of Babylon, his presence commanding yet calm, his thoughts shaping the destiny of an empire. Hammurabi, king of Babylon, was no mere conqueror. He was a builder of civilization, a lawgiver whose vision would carve his name into eternity. In a land long fractured by rivalries and warfare, Hammurabi sought not just to rule but to unite. His dream was bold, his methods precise, and his legacy unparalleled. Babylon, once a modest city among many in Mesopotamia, rose under Hammurabi like a star piercing the night. His ascent was not immediate but methodical, marked by alliances forged with care and battles fought with precision. The kingdoms around him, fragmented and worn, underestimated the quiet strength of Babylon. They did not see the tide until it swept them away. Hammurabi's brilliance lay not only in his ability to conquer but in his understanding of what followed. War was a tool, but peace was the foundation upon which empires endured. Under his rule, the city of Babylon blossomed. It became a hub of trade, its streets alive with merchants selling goods from far-flung lands. Grain from the plains of Mesopotamia, lapis lazuli from the mountains, and spices from unknown regions passed through its gates, enriching both the city and its people. Yet Hammurabi's vision extended beyond wealth and power. He saw a society not as a collection of individuals but as a living organism, one that thrived when governed by fairness and order. In a world where might often dictated right, Hammurabi offered a revolutionary idea, a codified system of laws that applied to all. His code, inscribed on a towering black stone, was more than a list of rules, it was a promise. It proclaimed that justice was not the privilege of the strong but the right of every citizen. The laws themselves were detailed and exacting, covering every aspect of life: trade, property, family, crime. They set punishments, often harsh, but they also established standards for fairness. A farmer who leased his land, a merchant who shipped goods, a servant who sought protection, all found their concerns addressed in Hammurabi's code. It was not a perfect system, but it was revolutionary, binding together a diverse population under a shared understanding of justice. The daily life of Babylon reflected the order Hammurabi had envisioned. Farmers tended the fields with knowledge handed down through generations, their crops feeding the city and fueling its trade. Artisans shaped clay into bricks, metal into tools, and stone into sculptures, their hands crafting the physical fabric of a civilization. Scribes, trained in the intricate script of cuneiform, recorded transactions, contracts, and laws, preserving the lifeblood of the economy and the culture. Temples stood as both spiritual centers and places of community, their priests not just intermediaries to the gods, but stewards of knowledge and tradition. Economically, Babylon thrived under Hammurabi. The canals that carried water to the fields also carried barges laden with goods, connecting the city to its neighbors and beyond. Trade routes expanded, and with them came ideas, technologies, and cultural exchanges. This was not a static society, it was dynamic, constantly absorbing and adapting, yet always rooted in the stability Hammurabi's rule provided. Culturally, Babylon was a city of richness and complexity. Songs and stories echoed in its courtyards, celebrating the gods and heroes of a people who saw their world as deeply intertwined with the divine. Temples, with their towering ziggurats, were more than architectural marvels, they were symbols of the connection between earth and heaven, humanity and the gods. Life in Babylon, though structured by laws and shaped by rulers, was vibrant, filled with the energy of a people who believed in their place within a grand cosmic order. But Hammurabi was not immortal, and the strength of Babylon, though great, was not infinite. His reign marked the pinnacle of what would later be called the Old Babylonian Empire. Yet the seeds of decline were already present, hidden beneath the surface of prosperity. The challenges of governing such a vast and diverse land, the strains of defending its borders, and the ambitions of those who followed would test Babylon in ways Hammurabi himself could not have foreseen. Still, the image of Hammurabi, standing tall, gazing at the stone upon which his code was inscribed, remains a powerful symbol. It is a reminder of what leadership can achieve, of how order can emerge from chaos, and of the enduring power of ideas. For in the story of Hammurabi and Babylon, we see not just the rise of a city or an empire, but the rise of civilization itself, its foundation built upon the ideals of justice, strength, and vision. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, golden light over the clay tablets stacked neatly in the scribes' chambers. The quiet hum of a world waking up echoed through the streets of Mesopotamia. But there, in the stillness of the morning, the scribes began their work, writing not just words, but the very foundation of knowledge, a knowledge that would transcend time. In the heart of this ancient land, where rivers flowed like lifeblood and the earth cracked open to reveal hidden treasures, a golden age of learning and discovery was quietly unfolding. For the people of Mesopotamia, the sky was not just a dome overhead but a map to be understood. The stars, brilliant points of light, were seen as messages from the gods, and it was the wise men and women of the land who sought to unlock their mysteries. Mathematics, once a simple tool for counting grain and measuring land, evolved into something far greater. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians looked to the heavens, their eyes following the celestial dance of planets, the phases of the moon, the path of the sun. In the quiet stillness of observatories, where the priests and scholars spent nights under the vast, starlit sky, the foundations of astronomy were laid. They discovered that the moon followed a predictable cycle, that the planets moved in strange, looping paths, and that time itself could be divided into months and years with stunning precision. They were the first to create a system of calendars, allowing the world to revolve not just around the seasons, but around an understanding of time itself, measured in hours, days, and months. Each calculation, each observation, was a step toward unraveling the universe's great, hidden order. Mathematics and astronomy were not the only fields where Mesopotamian minds shone. Medicine, too, became a field of study that reflected the civilization's deep desire for understanding. Doctors, though not trained as we would expect today, had a remarkable grasp of the human body. They knew the importance of herbs and potions, and through trial and error, discovered remedies for ailments that would echo down the centuries. They wrote down their observations, each tablet inscribed with the knowledge that could heal a wound or soothe a fever. Some cures were based on superstitions, of course, but others were rooted in genuine understanding, a testament to the scientific curiosity that thrived in the heart of Mesopotamia. Yet, it was not only the practical sciences that flourished. The same society that mapped the stars and healed the sick also created some of the most beautiful and profound stories the world would ever know. In the cool shade of the great ziggurats, around flickering fires, the people of Mesopotamia began to tell tales, stories not only of kings and gods, but of human hearts, filled with love, sorrow, and longing. Myths took shape, stories woven together from the very fabric of the culture. The gods walked among men, their personalities as varied and rich as the people who told their tales. In the bustling streets of Babylon and Ur, the epics of the gods were recited, each one a doorway to a universe where mortal lives were entwined with the divine. The story of Gilgamesh, the mighty king, echoed through the centuries, a tale of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. His journey to the cedar forest, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, and his quest for eternal life were not just stories but reflections of the human condition itself. These were not mere myths, they were the very essence of humanity, written in stone for future generations. The hymns and prayers to the gods echoed throughout Mesopotamian cities, sung in the temples by priests and priestesses, their voices rising in unison with the crackle of incense and the flickering flames of sacred fires. These hymns spoke of gratitude, of sorrow, and of the hope that humanity could bridge the divide between earth and the heavens. The people knew that the gods were powerful and unpredictable, but they also believed that through ritual, through the right words, they could gain favor and protection. In these sacred songs and prayers, the ancient voices of Mesopotamia blended with the timeless longing of the human soul to understand the divine. In this society, the scribes were more than just record keepers. They were the keepers of memory, the protectors of knowledge. It was they who recorded the deeds of kings, the laws that governed the people, and the stories that defined a culture. Every tablet was a thread in a vast tapestry of history, each inscribed word a piece of a puzzle that would one day reveal the grandeur of a civilization. Without the scribes, much of what we know today about Mesopotamia would have been lost to time. They were the bridge between the ancient world and the future, preserving the intellectual legacy of their people for the generations yet to come. The education of a scribe was no simple task. It required years of study, hours spent mastering the complex cuneiform script, a system that could be written on clay or carved into stone, depending on the need. These students were taught not only to read and write, but to understand the world around them, to recognize the patterns of nature, the relationships between numbers, and the stories of their gods and kings. The scribal school, with its rows of students hunched over tablets, was a center of learning where the light of knowledge burned bright. As the scribes wrote, they did more than record, they created. They shaped a legacy that would echo through the centuries, not just in the content of the tablets, but in the very idea that knowledge should be preserved. They understood, in a way, that the written word had power, power to preserve, power to teach, and power to transcend time. These scribes were not mere servants of the king, nor were they simply agents of bureaucracy. They were the cultural architects, the ones who turned fleeting moments into eternal stories. In the heart of Mesopotamia, amid the hum of daily life, science, literature, and education flourished. The accomplishments of the people, their discoveries in mathematics, their understanding of the stars, their mastery of medicine, and their powerful stories were not isolated events but part of a greater, unfolding narrative. This was a time when the thirst for knowledge was unquenchable, when the pursuit of understanding was as sacred as the worship of the gods themselves. The desert wind swept across the plains, carrying with it whispers from far-off lands, tales of distant kingdoms, cultures, and peoples whose paths were destined to cross in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. There, beneath the shadow of towering ziggurats and the hum of bustling trade, the stage was set for a drama that would unfold across centuries. Kingdoms from all sides, some neighbors, some far-flung, moved in and out of the region, like shifting tides. The Hittites, the Elamites, and the Kassites, each with their own ambitions, beliefs, and desires, stood poised at the edges of Mesopotamian influence, where the past and future would collide. For the people of Mesopotamia, life was never a solitary affair. The Tigris and Euphrates were not just rivers, they were lifelines that linked civilizations, drawing merchants, travelers, and invaders from lands near and far. Trade routes were the arteries that connected the beating heart of Mesopotamia to the wider world. On those roads, ideas traveled as much as goods did, weaving a tapestry of shared knowledge that stretched far beyond the borders of the ancient city-states. Through these routes, goods like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from Anatolia, and precious timber from the forests of the north found their way into Mesopotamian markets. And in return, the Mesopotamians sent their finest textiles, pottery, and grain to distant lands, as well as their most precious treasure, wisdom. It was in this exchange of ideas and goods that the Hittites, the Elamites, and the Kassites would find themselves drawn into the orbit of Mesopotamia's mighty civilization. These people were not strangers to the region. For centuries, they had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, their own histories marked by battles fought, cities built, and dreams realized. The Hittites, once thought to be a distant and isolated people, had begun to forge their own path toward power. They came from the heart of Anatolia, a land of high, windswept plateaus, a place where the earth itself seemed to bristle with the energy of the mountains. Fierce and determined, the Hittites sought to carve out their own empire, their eyes locked on the rich, fertile plains of Mesopotamia. In their quest for dominance, they clashed with the powerful city-states of the region, and as with all wars, it was not just the battles fought with weapons, but with ideas, technology, and culture. It was the Hittites who introduced new methods of warfare to the region, bringing with them the chariot, a weapon of unparalleled speed and destruction. The chariot became a symbol of the Hittite might, racing across the battlefield, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. But it wasn't just war that they brought to the Mesopotamians. The Hittites also carried with them innovations in law, governance, and art. Their code of laws, which mirrored the famed Code of Hammurabi, introduced new ways of thinking about justice and social order, while their knowledge of metallurgy, specifically ironworking, would change the world forever. The exchange of such knowledge would shape the future of the region in ways that no one could have anticipated. To the southeast, the Elamites were rising from the land that lay between the Zagros Mountains and the Persian Gulf. The Elamites had long been neighbors to Mesopotamia, but their relationship was complex, marked by both cooperation and conflict. In one moment, the Elamites were allies, trading goods and sharing knowledge. In the next, they were invaders, raiding Mesopotamian cities and capturing treasures from the temples of gods. Their capital, Susa, stood as a symbol of their resilience, a city that was both a beacon of Elamite power and a testament to their enduring cultural exchange with their Mesopotamian neighbors. The Elamites brought with them their own set of traditions and wisdom, some of which would leave an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of the region. They adopted the cuneiform script from Mesopotamia, not merely as a tool for recording laws and commerce, but as a way to express their stories, their myths, and their aspirations. The exchange of goods between the Elamites and Mesopotamians was crucial, but it was the exchange of ideas, the belief systems, the art, the technology, that truly shaped both cultures. In their intricate pottery, their metalworking, and their architecture, traces of Mesopotamian influence can still be seen, an enduring legacy of a long history of shared history. And then there were the Kassites. They arrived on the scene as if from nowhere, an enigmatic people whose origins remained shrouded in mystery. Yet their impact on Mesopotamia was undeniable. After the fall of Babylon to the Hittites, the Kassites rose to power, establishing a dynasty that would last for centuries. Unlike their more warlike neighbors, the Kassites were pragmatic and diplomatic. They understood the power of alliances and forged relationships with both the Hittites and the Elamites. In doing so, they ensured the survival of Babylon for generations, protecting it from external threats while quietly strengthening its influence over the region. Under the Kassites, Babylon flourished once again. Trade with distant lands resumed, and the city became a center for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. It was the Kassites who, in many ways, preserved the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia, including the cuneiform script, while also incorporating elements of their own culture. The blending of these traditions created a unique cultural mosaic that would influence the entire region. Yet, despite the relative peace that the Kassites brought, tensions remained. The Hittites and Elamites, with their own ambitions, constantly tested the boundaries of Mesopotamian power. Conflicts and trade agreements, alliances and betrayals, all of these wove a complicated web that stretched across the landscape of the ancient Near East. The rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of trade, the shifting of alliances, all of these events unfolded in the shadow of Mesopotamian influence. Through it all, one thing remained constant: the deep cultural currents that flowed between these civilizations, binding them together in ways that would shape the future of the ancient world. It was not just war or conquest that defined this period, it was the exchange of knowledge, the blending of ideas, and the recognition that despite their differences, these civilizations were united by a shared destiny. From the Hittites, the Elamites, and the Kassites, Mesopotamia would borrow, adapt, and give back in ways that would leave a lasting imprint on the history of the ancient world. The city of Assur lay at the crossroads of ancient empires, its walls built from the earth itself, standing strong and defiant. Its name echoed across the plains, carried by the winds of a new power rising in the east. Once a small settlement, Assur had grown into something greater, something formidable. The people who lived there, fiercely proud of their city, looked upon it not just as a home, but as a symbol of their destiny. They were the Assyrians, and they were ready to carve their name into the annals of history. It was here, in this place, that the old Assyrian kingdom began to take shape. Assur had been the seat of the god Ashur, and under the watchful gaze of their divine protector, the Assyrians felt invincible. The land around them was harsh and unforgiving, but it was this very landscape that shaped them into a people of unmatched toughness and resilience. They learned to adapt to the cruel, arid environment, where every drop of water was precious, and every scrap of land had to be fought for. The rise of Assyria was not a slow and gentle ascent, but a fierce storm that swept through the region. As their kings expanded their reach, they made their presence felt through military might and strategic brilliance. They were warriors, but also conquerors, transforming themselves into a dominating force that would come to rule over vast territories. Their armies, led by generals whose names would become legends, marched relentlessly across the Near East, breaking the back of any who dared to stand against them. The Assyrians had perfected the art of war. Their armies were not just large, they were ruthless, disciplined, and innovative. They introduced new tactics and weapons that would change the face of warfare. One of their most deadly innovations was the chariot, a weapon of destruction that allowed them to strike fast and hard before their enemies even had time to react. Their cavalry, swift and tireless, became the backbone of their military might. The Assyrians were the first to use iron weapons on a large scale, giving them an advantage that their foes could scarcely match. They learned to lay siege to cities, breaking through walls with battering rams, and starve entire populations into submission with cunning strategies. The very sight of Assyrian soldiers on the horizon was enough to send terror through the hearts of even the most fortified cities. But Assyria's power did not rest solely on its military dominance. The kings of Assyria understood the importance of propaganda, and they built a legacy of art and architecture that would tell the story of their might for generations to come. The walls of their palaces were adorned with reliefs depicting the glory of their kings, ruthless, mighty men whose conquests were immortalized in stone. These images showed not only their victories, but also their ability to control the people they had conquered, shaping their empire into a well-oiled machine of subjugation. One of the most iconic examples of Assyrian art is the bas-reliefs from the palace of King Ashurnasirpal II. These images were not mere decorations, they were statements of power, designed to instill fear and admiration in equal measure. They depicted scenes of the king's military campaigns, his victories, his enemies trembling before him. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the detail so vivid that it felt as if the figures would come to life at any moment. The Assyrian kings were not just rulers, they were gods among men, their strength and power immortalized on the walls of their grand palaces. Yet, for all their cruelty and domination, the Assyrians were also a people of culture. They built libraries that would become the heart of knowledge in the ancient world. The most famous of these was the library of Ashurbanipal, which housed thousands of clay tablets filled with records, wisdom, and literature from all corners of the empire. These texts contained everything from scientific treatises to myths and epics, preserving the stories of the past and the knowledge of a people who had mastered the art of both war and culture. The Assyrians were not just conquerors, they were keepers of knowledge, and they understood the importance of preserving it for future generations. The arts flourished in Assyria as well. Their palaces were filled with beautiful carvings, statues, and intricate designs that spoke to a culture that valued craftsmanship and beauty. Though their empire was built on the foundations of conquest, it was also a civilization that appreciated the finer things in life. They created music, poetry, and literature that captured the essence of their people, warriors, yes, but also poets and artists who could see the world with a deeper, more reflective eye. Assyrian rule stretched across the ancient world, from the Zagros Mountains in the east to Egypt in the west, from Anatolia in the north to the Arabian deserts in the south. The empire was a vast, sprawling entity that stretched across continents, its influence felt in every corner of the known world. They controlled the major trade routes, which brought wealth into the heart of their empire, and their cities became the bustling centers of commerce and culture. The Assyrians were masters of administration, able to govern their far-flung empire with a level of efficiency that few others could match. But the Assyrians were not just rulers, they were also builders. They constructed grand cities with imposing walls and towering gateways, designed not only for defense but to show the might of their kings. The city of Nineveh, under King Sennacherib, became one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world. Its walls were adorned with beautiful reliefs, its gates were carved with images of gods and kings, and its gardens were the envy of all who saw them. Nineveh was a city of grandeur, a reflection of Assyria's might, and yet it was also a symbol of the empire's cultural richness and its ability to blend power with beauty. The Assyrians, with their military might and artistic achievements, left a legacy that would resonate throughout history. They were a civilization defined by its strength, its cruelty, and its brilliance. Their conquests reshaped the ancient world, and their contributions to art, culture, and knowledge would endure long after their empire had fallen. In the end, the rise of Assyria was more than just a story of war, it was a testament to the power of innovation, the importance of culture, and the eternal struggle between strength and wisdom. Nineveh stood tall, its grand walls towering above the plains like a proud beast, both a city of magnificence and a fortress of strength. Inside, the heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire pulsed with life, a buzzing, thriving metropolis, the pinnacle of all that Assyria had ever been. The people lived under the shadow of King Ashurbanipal, a ruler whose name was carved into the stone of history. The city glowed with the light of the finest art and the brightest minds, yet it simmered with the tension of a world that knew nothing but the harsh rhythm of power and conquest. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, was a man of both intellect and violence, his mind as sharp as the swords his soldiers wielded. He inherited a kingdom that was already formidable, but under his rule, Assyria reached its zenith, stretching across vast stretches of land. His empire was the largest and most powerful the world had ever seen, and it was his will that determined its fate. He was a master of strategy, a king whose ambition knew no bounds, pushing his army further and further until their conquest stretched from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of Persia. It was a time of unparalleled dominance. Ashurbanipal's army swept through the lands like a storm, unstoppable in its force. His soldiers were ruthless, leaving no quarter for their enemies, no matter how large or how strong. They took cities with precision and terror, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would be remembered for centuries. It was a ruthless empire, but it was also a proud one. Ashurbanipal's triumphs were etched into the world's memory, immortalized in the reliefs and inscriptions that filled the walls of Nineveh's palaces. But Ashurbanipal was not only a warrior king, he was also a scholar. In the heart of Nineveh, he created a library unlike any the world had ever seen, a vast collection of knowledge that would become the most famous of its time. The library of Ashurbanipal held thousands of clay tablets, texts of law, literature, science, and magic, preserving the wisdom of an empire that had known no equal. It was here, among these dusty scrolls and sacred tablets, that the future of Assyria could have been saved. Yet, even as knowledge flourished, there was a sense that the very foundation of this mighty empire was beginning to crack. The city of Nineveh, for all its glory, was built on the backs of its enemies. The people Ashurbanipal conquered were left in ruin, their cities burned to the ground, their families scattered. The empire's vast reach relied not just on its military might, but on its ability to maintain control over those it had subjugated. Each conquest added to Assyria's power, but it also built resentment. The empire spread itself too thin, reaching into regions where it could not always hold control. The further Ashurbanipal's armies marched, the more stretched thin the empire became, the more tenuous its hold on its lands. It was not just the people that grew restless, the land itself seemed to rebel against the weight of Assyria's might. The empire was now so vast, so sprawling, that even Ashurbanipal's strategic brilliance could not always reach every corner. His military campaigns continued, but as the years wore on, it became clear that the same forces that had once pushed Assyria to greatness were now sowing the seeds of its destruction. From the north and the west, enemies grew bolder, emboldened by the strains in Assyria's power. The Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, these were not the small, scattered kingdoms they had once been. They too had grown in strength, and they began to rise against their former overlord, slowly but surely. They were ready to strike when Assyria was at its weakest. The empire's great administration system, the one that had held its lands together for so long, began to crumble. The regions that had once been tightly controlled started to slip away from Assyria's grip, and rebellion brewed in the cities. Ashurbanipal, in his later years, found himself fighting not just for land, but for survival. His military prowess could not solve every problem. His empire had been built on the blood of the conquered, but it was now facing the anger of those very people. The Medes and Babylonians, once crushed beneath Assyrian boots, now rallied together, forming a coalition of fury. In the final years of Ashurbanipal's reign, Nineveh, once a shining beacon of Assyrian glory, began to show cracks. The once indomitable spirit of Assyria was beginning to wane. The city, with its towering walls and magnificent palaces, became the setting for an inevitable tragedy. The fall of Nineveh was not a single, sudden blow, but the slow collapse of an empire that had overreached, its power stretched thin and its people exhausted. The relentless expansion that had brought Assyria so much glory now led it to its downfall. In 612 BCE, the armies of the Babylonians and Medes came together in a final, decisive siege. The great walls of Nineveh, which had once withstood the test of time and the power of Assyria's enemies, were breached. The city that had held the wealth, knowledge, and power of Assyria for so long now lay in ruins. Ashurbanipal, the once mighty king, was gone, his empire crumbling to dust around him. The fall of Nineveh marked the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but it also marked the end of an era in the ancient world. Assyria's once unmatched dominance had been shattered, its kings and soldiers reduced to dust. The library of Ashurbanipal, once the beacon of knowledge and culture, was destroyed, the clay tablets that had held the empire's wisdom lost to time. The great art and architecture that had defined the Assyrian age was now buried beneath the ruins, a silent witness to the empire's rapid rise and tragic fall. In the end, the story of the Neo-Assyrian Empire is one of ambition, brilliance, and destruction. It was an empire that stretched too far, that reached for the stars only to fall back to earth. Its legacy lives on, but not in the glory it once held. Instead, it is a reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the price that must be paid for overreach. The story of Assyria is not just one of conquest and war, it is a lesson, written in stone, for those who would follow. Babylon, a city once fallen into ruin, now thrived like a jewel in the desert. Beneath the blazing sun, its walls shimmered with the promise of something more. The air was thick with the weight of history, and in the heart of it all stood Nebuchadnezzar II, a king whose vision had transformed his city into the most magnificent in the world. The very stones of Babylon seemed to hum with energy, a reflection of the power that surged through the veins of this once wounded empire. Nebuchadnezzar had inherited a kingdom that was already great, but he had the drive to make it immortal. His heart longed to rebuild, to restore Babylon to its former glory and beyond. And so he set to work, shaping his city like a sculptor chiseling his masterpiece. The brick walls rose higher, the palaces expanded, and temples dedicated to the gods filled the city with divine energy. The ancient city was reborn, its skyline now adorned with wonders. Towering ziggurats reached for the heavens, standing as a testament to the might of Nebuchadnezzar's vision. Yet, it was the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, that would seal Nebuchadnezzar's place in history. Built for his wife, Amytis of Media, who longed for the green hills of her homeland, the gardens were a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's devotion and his ingenuity. Layer upon layer of lush greenery spiraled upwards in defiance of the harsh desert landscape, water cascading down in delicate fountains. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and the air was rich with the scent of life, a stark contrast to the dry dust that surrounded the city. To stand in the gardens was to stand in the very heart of Nebuchadnezzar's love, a love not only for his wife, but for his kingdom and its people. The gardens became a dream made real, a place where the impossible seemed to bloom. Babylon had become more than just a city, it had become a symbol, a beacon of culture, religion, and power. Nebuchadnezzar's ambition had woven itself into the very fabric of the empire. He knew the weight of the gods upon his shoulders, and he believed his destiny was to build a city worthy of their favor. He spent years constructing temples, grand monuments, and sacred shrines that honored the Babylonian gods. Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, was at the center of it all, his great ziggurat dominating the cityscape. With each stone laid, Nebuchadnezzar invited the gods to watch over his people, to bless them with prosperity, and to ensure his reign would last for eternity. But Nebuchadnezzar's empire was not just built on stone and bricks. The heart of Babylon also lay in its people, the artisans, the scholars, the priests, and the traders who filled the city with life. The city's streets were alive with the sound of commerce, with goods flowing in from across the known world. Babylon was not just a political center, it was a cultural one, a place where knowledge was treasured, where art and literature flourished. People came from distant lands to learn, to trade, and to marvel at the city's splendor. Yet, beneath this golden surface, there was also the story of struggle, of hearts broken by war and captivity. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not just about the rise of Babylon, it was also marked by the exile of the Israelites, an event that would echo throughout history. The Israelites, once free in their homeland, found themselves bound in chains, taken from their land and brought to Babylon as captives. They were forced to leave behind everything they knew, their homes, their families, and their temple. In a strange land, under the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's mighty empire, they were forced to live as strangers, as slaves in the very city that gleamed with glory. Nebuchadnezzar's role in the exile was not just a matter of military conquest, it was a story of divine will, as the Israelites themselves would later come to believe. For Nebuchadnezzar, the Israelites were but one people among many he had conquered. Yet, as the years passed, the Israelites' faith in their God remained unbroken. They prayed for deliverance, for the return to their land, and for the restoration of their temple. To the Babylonians, it must have seemed like a distant, fading cry. To the exiled Israelites, it was everything. Nebuchadnezzar's empire was a place where power and mercy collided. While his city stood as a reflection of his might, his military campaigns were often ruthless. His wars were not just for conquest, but for dominance, and the exiled Israelites bore the brunt of that cost. Yet, it was in the very heart of Babylon, amid its beauty and power, that Nebuchadnezzar's name became forever tied to the fate of the Israelites. The towering ziggurats, the gardens, and the wealth of the empire were built on the backs of those he had subdued. And for all the splendor, there was a cost, an echo of sorrow that reverberated through time. In Babylon, the clash of cultures was not just a political reality, it was a spiritual one. The gods of Babylon, proud and powerful, were worshipped with grand rituals and ceremonies. Yet, the faith of the exiled Israelites stood apart, a faith that refused to bow to the gods of their captors. Nebuchadnezzar's great city, with all its magnificence, became the stage for a battle of belief, one that would shape the future of an entire people. The Israelites' resilience in their faith, even in captivity, would remain a defining feature of their story. Nebuchadnezzar's empire, in all its glory, stood at a crossroads between the divine and the human, between the weight of conquest and the promise of redemption. He built Babylon into a city that was remembered for centuries as a beacon of power and culture. But for the Israelites, Babylon would forever be the land of exile, a place of longing for what had been lost. And yet, amid the grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the city of Babylon itself became a symbol not only of greatness but of the deep sorrow and complex connections that history weaves. The hanging gardens, the towering temples, and the grand palaces would all fade in time, but the memory of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and its impact would last far longer than the walls of his city could ever hold. The weight of history shifted that day, when the great gates of Babylon, once a symbol of unmatched power, opened to welcome a new ruler. It was not the fierce roar of conquest that swept through the city, but a quiet, unexpected hope. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, had arrived. His victory over the Babylonians was swift, almost serene compared to the countless wars of destruction that had preceded it. Yet it was not just the fall of one empire that changed the course of Mesopotamia's history, but the dawn of a new era under a king who ruled with an unusual grace. When Cyrus entered the ancient city, the people didn't cheer out of fear, they welcomed him with open arms. His reign was different, marked by a rare kind of respect for the cultures he conquered. The walls of Babylon had been painted with stories of kings who ruled through force. But Cyrus was a king who ruled with wisdom and compassion. He knew that true power didn't just lie in strength, it resided in unity. By offering the exiled Jews the chance to return to their land, by respecting the gods of every conquered people, he laid the foundation for an empire that would stretch across the known world. Under Cyrus, Mesopotamia, once again, became the beating heart of a vast empire. Persia's vast territory grew, pulling the lands of the ancient world into its orbit. Cities that had once been rivals now found themselves part of the same great Persian empire. Babylon was no longer an isolated power, but an integral part of a greater whole. Cyrus didn't erase the past, he understood its power. Instead, he sought to integrate Mesopotamia's rich traditions and cultures into his own. Babylon's ziggurats, temples, and palaces remained, but now they stood side by side with the Persian imperial ambitions. It was a world where the old and the new could coexist, where cultures fused rather than collided. Cyrus' reign brought peace and prosperity to a land that had known endless cycles of warfare. His policies were built on respect. He established governance that was decentralized yet strong. Governors, known as satraps, oversaw the provinces, ensuring that order was maintained without heavy-handed interference. Trade flourished across Mesopotamia, linking the ancient cities with the far-flung reaches of the empire. The fertile lands of the Tigris and Euphrates were revitalized under Persian rule. The rivers, once choked with neglect and decay, once again flowed through the hearts of thriving communities. But even as the sun seemed to shine brighter over the Persian Empire, its power began to shift beneath the surface. The empire's might was built on cooperation, but as the years passed, tensions started to mount. The grand infrastructure of Persia, its roads, its canals, its majestic cities, was impressive, but it required a delicate balance of governance. A balance that, over time, became harder to maintain. While the Persian kings respected Mesopotamian culture, there were always whispers of a longing for the old ways, the old gods, the old dynasties. As the empire grew in size and complexity, its core began to fragment. Successive kings struggled to live up to the legacy of Cyrus. The Persians were no longer seen as the liberators, but as rulers whose influence became increasingly remote. The cultural unity that had once been a strength began to show cracks, as different regions, with their own rich traditions, started to feel the strain of Persian rule. The roads that had once connected cities began to feel like chains. The very prosperity that had come under Cyrus' reign began to stir unrest, as cities yearned for more autonomy. And then came the storm. A force of nature, unexpected and unstoppable, sweeping through everything in its path. Alexander of Macedonia, young and bold, arrived on the scene with a singular purpose: to conquer, to reshape the world. With a relentless drive and an army at his back, he broke through the Persian defenses like a flood breaking through a dam. The Persians fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. The Battle of Gaugamela, the final clash that sealed Persia's fate, was a brutal and defining moment. The sun, which had once set on a vast Persian empire, now rose over an empire that would never be the same. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire was swift. In just a few short years, the might of Persia crumbled under the weight of Alexander's conquests. The proud kings of Persia, the satraps, and the people who had once called Babylon their home now found themselves under the rule of a foreign king. The grand palaces of Persepolis, once filled with the sounds of Persian power, were now silenced, reduced to rubble. The canals, the great roads, the heart of the Persian Empire, all these marvels were left to fade in the dust of a new age. As the dust settled, the echoes of Cyrus' vision seemed to disappear. The unity he had built, the respect he had fostered, vanished in the wake of Alexander's sweeping power. The peace that had once reigned over Mesopotamia was shattered. Cities that had once flourished under Persian rule now found themselves swept into the chaos of Alexander's empire. The infrastructure, the trade routes, the cultural exchange that had defined the Achaemenid era began to wither under the weight of conquest and instability. Yet, even in the ruins, there was a strange sense of admiration for what the Achaemenids had built. The grand cities of Persia, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, stood as a reminder of a time when the world had come together in ways that no empire before had achieved. The legacy of the Achaemenids lived on in the stones of their cities, and the stories passed down by those who had known peace and prosperity under their rule. And as Alexander's empire began to fracture after his untimely death, the world would slowly shift once more. The legacy of the Achaemenid Empire, though it fell to ruin, would still leave its mark on the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. It would live on in the very spirit of Mesopotamia, where the rise and fall of empires had always been part of the ever-turning wheel of history. For all the bloodshed and loss, the essence of Mesopotamia's enduring strength, its ability to rebuild, to adapt, and to carry forward its culture, remained, like the rivers that had always sustained its people. The land may have changed hands, but its soul remained untouched. The city of Babylon, once the heart of the ancient world, now lay in a strange stillness under the weight of an unfamiliar influence. After the fall of Persia, after the dust had settled from the storm that Alexander the Great had unleashed, the land found itself swept into the tide of change. A new world, with new ideas, poured into Mesopotamia like an unstoppable current. It was a world that spoke a language of philosophy, science, art, and conquest, a world that carried the echo of Alexander's dream, of a blending of cultures, of unity across the known world. The streets of Babylon, which had once echoed with the voices of Sumerians, Babylonians, Persians, now hummed with the unmistakable sound of Greek. It was a language of ambition, a language of the future, but it was foreign to the ancient soil of Mesopotamia. Yet, the city wasn't overrun by this new influence. Instead, it began to absorb it, to transform it, and in doing so, created something entirely new. The Hellenistic age, birthed from the conquests of a Macedonian king, slowly took root in the land, not as a conqueror's imposition, but as a seed planted in fertile soil, growing and changing with every passing day. In the years that followed Alexander's death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, carved up his empire like pieces of a broken mirror. Among them, the Seleucid dynasty claimed Mesopotamia. Under their rule, the lands of ancient Babylon and its neighboring territories became part of a much larger empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the heart of Iran. It was a sprawling domain where Greek and Persian customs collided and fused. Babylon's ancient temples still stood, their towering ziggurats casting long shadows over the city, but now they were surrounded by new buildings, new ways of life, and new rulers. The Seleucids, while inheriting much of the grandeur of Alexander's vision, were faced with a task far more complex than their Macedonian predecessor had ever anticipated. They needed to govern a land that had known centuries of powerful kingdoms and empires. The cultures of Mesopotamia were ancient, rich, and proud. Yet the Seleucid kings, despite being far from their Greek homeland, understood the necessity of adaptation. They began to blend the old with the new. In the streets of cities like Antioch and Seleucia, one could see Greek statues placed beside Babylonian idols. Greek philosophy and Persian wisdom intermingled in the minds of scholars. Greek language and local dialects mingled in the marketplace as merchants and peasants, priests and kings, all participated in this cultural melting pot. Yet, even as the Seleucid Empire grew, cracks began to appear in its foundation. The cultural blending that had been so carefully nurtured, that had held together the diverse peoples of the empire, began to fray. Not everyone welcomed the Greek influence. For some, it was an intrusion, a reminder of foreign rulers who, despite their attempts to blend cultures, were still conquerors. And there were those who feared that the ancient ways of Mesopotamia, the rituals, the gods, the customs that had sustained them for centuries, would be lost forever in the tide of Hellenistic thought. The tension between the old and the new began to stir unrest. Beyond these internal challenges, the Seleucids were faced with external threats that would further erode their fragile control over the region. From the east came the Parthians, a fierce, relentless people who were determined to carve out their own place in the world. They were not content to be subjugated by Greek rulers, nor were they willing to let the Seleucids maintain their hold on Mesopotamia without a fight. The Parthian Empire, rising from the Iranian plateau, presented a formidable challenge. Their military prowess, their ability to unite the nomadic tribes of the steppes, threatened to undo everything the Seleucids had worked to establish. It was a time of brutal conflict. The Seleucid army, though initially strong, began to weaken under the constant pressure of Parthian incursions. The Parthians, with their skilled cavalry, managed to push the Seleucids back, slowly but steadily. The great cities of Mesopotamia, once the pride of a vast empire, became battlegrounds, their streets stained with the blood of warriors from both sides. The Seleucids, whose rulers had once stood tall in the palaces of Babylon, now found themselves retreating, their empire slipping through their fingers like sand. Amidst this turmoil, there was still beauty. The Seleucids may have been losing their hold on Mesopotamia, but the cultural fusion they had sparked continued to flourish in quieter corners of the empire. Artisans painted murals that told the stories of both Greek heroes and Mesopotamian gods. Sculptors blended the sharp, idealized features of Greek figures with the ancient traditions of the East. The great library at Antioch, though threatened by the instability around it, preserved knowledge from both Greece and the ancient Near East. It became a symbol of what could be achieved when cultures collided, not in destruction, but in creation. Yet, as the Parthians continued to press westward, the Seleucid Empire's light began to flicker. The Parthian Empire was growing stronger, and the Seleucids, stretched thin by constant warfare, began to lose their grip on the regions that had once made them powerful. The fall of Seleucia in 141 BCE was a defining moment. The Parthians now ruled much of Mesopotamia, and the Seleucids, unable to hold on to their former glory, were forced to retreat. The cities that had once been the pride of the Hellenistic world, Babylon, Antioch, Seleucia, no longer stood as symbols of Greek dominance. They had become the battlegrounds of history, with their futures uncertain. As the Seleucid Empire crumbled, the echoes of Hellenistic influence still lingered. The Greek language continued to be spoken in the region, though it was slowly replaced by Aramaic. The cities that had once been a blend of East and West now fell into the hands of new conquerors, but the cultural exchange that had defined the Seleucid era remained part of the fabric of Mesopotamian identity. Even as new rulers took control, the memories of a time when Greek and Persian worlds had collided would never fade. For those who lived through it, the Seleucid period was a time of hope and fear, of blending and breaking, of trying to forge something new from the rich, ancient traditions of Mesopotamia. The world was changing, and Mesopotamia, as always, was at the center of it all, caught between the past and the future, between the old gods and new ideas, between the push of conquest and the pull of culture. The legacy of the Seleucids may have faded, but the story of their influence, and the way they changed Mesopotamia forever, would live on in the echoes of the past. The sun beat down on the dry, cracked earth of Mesopotamia, as it had for centuries. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed steadily, their waters carving paths through the land that had once been the cradle of civilizations. But change, as it always does, swept across this ancient land, and the winds carried with them a new power, a new vision. The Parthians, with their fierce warriors and vast empire, took their place among the towering ziggurats and the ruins of past empires. The old ways, the old gods, seemed to be fading, replaced by something altogether different, a shift that could not be ignored. The Parthians arrived like a storm, their rise as sudden as the desert winds. For centuries, Mesopotamia had known the might of empires, from the Assyrians to the Babylonians, but the Parthians brought with them a new style of rule, one that focused on flexibility and decentralized power. The land of Mesopotamia, which had seen so much bloodshed, now found itself under the control of a people who were as diverse as the region itself. The Parthians understood the value of keeping the old traditions alive while asserting their own control. It was a delicate balance, and at first, it seemed to work. But the Parthians were not only conquerors. They were traders, merchants, and diplomats, and Mesopotamia's position at the crossroads of the ancient world made it a hub for commerce, culture, and exchange. The Parthian rulers encouraged this trade, drawing merchants from all corners of the world, India, China, Rome, and beyond. The great cities of Mesopotamia, like Ctesiphon, became bustling centers of activity where goods and ideas passed freely, as easily as the rivers that cut through the land. Yet, as trade flowed, so too did new ideas. The most profound of these was Zoroastrianism. This ancient Persian religion, founded by the prophet Zoroaster, began to spread its roots deep into Mesopotamian soil. The Parthians themselves were devout followers of Zoroastrianism, and under their rule, the religion began to shape the cultural landscape of the land. Temples to Ahura Mazda rose alongside older places of worship, casting long shadows over the ancient cities. The fire that symbolized the eternal struggle between good and evil burned brightly in the hearts of the Parthians and the people they ruled. Zoroastrianism was not just a religion. It was a worldview, a way of life that permeated every aspect of society. It was a belief in the eternal battle between light and darkness, truth and falsehood. For the people of Mesopotamia, it was a new way to make sense of the world, a new lens through which to view their lives. They had always believed in the power of the gods, but now there was something more, something that spoke of a greater, cosmic struggle, of a divine order that governed the universe. It was a belief that resonated with many, and in time, it would become a dominant force in the region. But change never comes without resistance, and as the Parthians established their control over Mesopotamia, they faced challenges from within and without. The traditional cities, with their deep-rooted connections to the gods and their ancient ways, often clashed with the Parthian emphasis on trade and flexibility. The old priests, guardians of the ancient temples, saw the rise of Zoroastrianism as a threat, a challenge to their centuries-old authority. For some, the new order was too foreign, too distant from the old ways that had governed their lives for so long. Despite these tensions, the Parthian Empire grew strong, its capital of Ctesiphon a symbol of their power and their ability to blend the old and the new. The Parthians built great walls, fortresses, and palaces that reflected their strength and their vision for the future. Yet, beneath this grandeur, there was always a quiet sense of fragility, for the empire's strength rested not only on its military might, but also on the delicate balance of cultures it had forged. To maintain that balance was to maintain control. And to lose it was to risk everything. The Sasanian Empire followed in the footsteps of the Parthians, bringing with it its own set of changes and challenges. The Sasanians, like their predecessors, were Zoroastrians, but they also sought to forge a more centralized and powerful empire. Under their rule, Mesopotamia became more firmly entrenched in Persian culture. The Sasanian kings viewed themselves as heirs to the ancient Persian tradition, and they sought to restore the glory of the Achaemenid Empire. They rebuilt cities, reformed the military, and reasserted the power of the Zoroastrian priesthood. The old ways were not only preserved, they were revitalized. The rise of the Sasanians marked a new chapter in Mesopotamian history. Their empire, while not as expansive as the Achaemenid Empire before it, was no less powerful. The Sasanian rulers were determined to create an empire that was both strong and enduring, and they used the same tools as the Parthians, trade, diplomacy, and military might, to achieve their goals. But while the Parthians had thrived through a kind of loose, decentralized rule, the Sasanians sought greater control, centralizing their power in the hands of the king and the priesthood. The consequences of this shift were profound. The people of Mesopotamia, who had once enjoyed a level of freedom under the Parthians, now found themselves more firmly under the control of a centralized government. The rise of Zoroastrianism as the state religion solidified its position in the region, but it also alienated many who clung to older beliefs. The Sasanian kings, though powerful, could not erase the diversity of Mesopotamian thought, and the ancient gods and traditions continued to influence the culture. Yet, for all the political and religious changes, Mesopotamia remained as vital as ever. The land was a crossroads, a place where East met West, where the goods, ideas, and cultures of the ancient world converged. Trade continued to flow through the cities, bringing wealth, knowledge, and connections to far-off lands. The great caravanserais, where merchants from India, Arabia, and Rome met to exchange goods and stories, hummed with life. The Parthians and Sasanians may have ruled, but it was the people of Mesopotamia who kept the flow of culture and commerce alive, weaving together the old and the new into something uniquely their own. Through all the shifts, through all the battles and changes, Mesopotamia remained a place of transformation, a land that had seen the rise and fall of empires, but whose heart beat with the rhythms of trade, belief, and culture. Under the Parthians and Sasanians, Mesopotamia became a symbol of resilience, a place where even the most dramatic changes could not extinguish the flames of its ancient spirit. The winds of change swept through the lands of Mesopotamia, as they always had, shifting the world's course in ways that none could have predicted. It wasn't the roar of an invading army that heralded the change, but the quiet yet powerful call of a new belief system, carried by the voices of those who would reshape everything. The Sasanian Empire, once a mighty force that had dominated the region, fell in the blink of an eye, its ancient symbols and power crumbling as the Islamic conquest surged forward like a tidal wave. The land, so long the cradle of civilization, found itself transformed, not by force alone, but by a spirit of new faith and knowledge. The Sasanian Empire had collapsed, leaving behind a political vacuum that was quickly filled by a people who would change the course of history forever. The Islamic caliphates that followed saw their influence spread swiftly across the region, from the burning deserts of Arabia to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. It was not just the change in rulers that mattered, but the fundamental shift in how the people saw the world. For the Mesopotamians, the land that had once been home to gods, kings, and empires, the arrival of Islam marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter. As the smoke of battle cleared, the city of Baghdad began to rise from the dust. A city that would soon become the heart of the Islamic world, an intellectual beacon, a place where knowledge, science, and art would flourish beyond imagination. The rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates flowed as they always had, but now they nourished not only the crops but the minds of a new generation. In Baghdad, a new civilization was born, one that carried forward the wisdom of the ancients, but was also bound to create its own legacy. Baghdad became more than a city. It was a symbol of the convergence of cultures, ideas, and knowledge that had flowed through Mesopotamia for thousands of years. The city's streets echoed with the sound of scholars debating, writing, and translating texts from the ancient world, from Greek philosophy to Persian poetry. Here, the ideas of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen were not lost but absorbed and expanded upon. The knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians was woven into the fabric of the New World, enriching it in ways that could not have been foreseen. In the heart of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom stood as a testament to the power of knowledge. It was a place where scholars from all corners of the world came together, where the wisdom of the past met the hopes of the future. The great minds of the time, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and philosophers, gathered in this sanctuary of learning. Their discoveries would shape not only the Islamic world but the entire course of human history. The stars that had once been navigated by Babylonian astronomers were now charted by the scholars of Baghdad, their understanding of the heavens pushing the boundaries of what was known. Yet, even as Baghdad grew into a beacon of knowledge, it was clear that this new world was built on the foundations laid by the Mesopotamians centuries before. The advancements in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy that flourished under the Abbasid Caliphate were not born in a vacuum. They were the culmination of a long history of scientific inquiry that had begun in the shadow of the ancient ziggurats. The Babylonians had been among the first to observe the stars with care, and their meticulous records of the heavens had been preserved, passed down through generations, ultimately reaching the scholars in Baghdad who would build upon them. The greatness of Mesopotamian innovations, agriculture, writing, law, and engineering had already laid the groundwork for the future. It was in Mesopotamia that the wheel had first turned, that the cuneiform script had been carved into clay, and that the first laws had been inscribed on stone tablets. These achievements had reverberated through time, influencing cultures far and wide, and their echoes could still be felt in the halls of learning in Baghdad. The Islamic scholars of the Abbasid era didn't discard the past, they embraced it, honoring the work of those who came before them and using it as a stepping stone to new heights. One could walk through the markets of Baghdad, seeing the ancient trade routes that once connected Mesopotamia to Egypt, India, and beyond, now flourishing once more. The bustling caravans carried not only spices, silk, and precious metals, but also ideas, philosophies, and innovations that continued to flow into and out of the city. The trade routes that had brought the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans to Mesopotamia now connected the world in ways that had never been imagined. But as Baghdad thrived, it was not without its challenges. The world was changing, and not all of the changes were peaceful. There were those who resisted the new faith, those who felt the weight of the old ways slipping away. But even in the face of resistance, the enduring power of Mesopotamia's legacy remained undeniable. The Islamic world, with its new laws, its new faith, and its new vision, stood on the shoulders of the ancient civilizations that had come before. The echoes of the past could still be heard in the mosques, the schools, and the libraries that filled the streets of Baghdad. Mesopotamia, once a land of gods and kings, had become a land of scholars and visionaries. The shift to Islamic rule was not simply a conquest, it was the beginning of a new age, one in which the lessons of the past were not forgotten but celebrated. The fall of the Sasanian Empire may have marked the end of one era, but it also marked the dawn of another. As the city of Baghdad continued to grow, it stood as a reminder of how history is not a straight line, but a web of interwoven stories. The contributions of Mesopotamia's past did not fade away, they lived on, transformed and reimagined by a new generation. The legacy of the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, from the Sumerians to the Babylonians to the Persians, continued to shape the world, even as the landscape itself shifted under the weight of new rulers and new ideas. And though the sands of time may have buried many of the ancient structures, the knowledge and wisdom of the land remained eternal, passed down through the ages, lighting the way for future generations. The dust of thousands of years had settled over the ruins, and the voices of ancient civilizations seemed to be silenced forever. The great cities of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Nineveh, Ur, lay buried beneath the earth, their stories forgotten as time passed. But beneath that thick, silent veil of history, the echoes of humanity's earliest achievements still lingered, waiting to be heard once more. Then, one fateful day, the earth trembled just slightly, as it has a way of doing when it holds a secret long hidden. And from that tremor, a new age of discovery began, bringing with it the breathtaking realization that Mesopotamia's story was not lost, it had merely been waiting to be rediscovered. The first whispers of this rediscovery began in the 19th century, when European explorers ventured into the lands of the ancient Middle East, driven by a hunger for knowledge and an unshakable belief that the past still held answers. Their eyes opened wide as they uncovered monumental ruins, their hands brushing off centuries of dirt to reveal the grandeur of what had once been. In the ruins of Nineveh, the remains of the Assyrian Empire came to life in fragments, carved stone reliefs that depicted battles, gods, and kings. They were the first clues to a world that had once thrived, a world whose legacy had been buried beneath time's unyielding sands. As the explorers turned their attention to the ancient mounds and buried cities, they discovered something even more incredible. In the rubble of Mesopotamia, they found what seemed like a secret language, hidden in the form of wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets. It was a script that had been used for centuries, yet no one had read it for over 2 millennia. These mysterious symbols, cuneiform, held the key to understanding the people who had once ruled the land, to the stories they had written, the laws they had carved, and the prayers they had inscribed to their gods. But how could they unlock this ancient code? How could they bring these forgotten voices back to life? The answer came in the form of scholars, passionate, dedicated individuals who saw cuneiform as more than just marks on clay. They saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a doorway into an ancient world that had been closed for far too long. The breakthrough came in the 19th century when Sir Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer stationed in Persia, cracked the code of the Behistun inscription, a massive, trilingual inscription carved into a cliffside. His deciphering of the cuneiform script opened the floodgates for the world to read the messages left by the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. The once distant voices of ancient kings, scribes, and common people now spoke to us across the millennia. The breakthrough in deciphering cuneiform was a triumph not just for scholars but for humanity itself. It was the moment when history truly came alive, when the figures of the ancient world were no longer shadows, but fully realized individuals with names, faces, and stories. Kings like Hammurabi and Ashurbanipal were no longer just names in dusty old books. They became real men, with ambitions, triumphs, and failures. The laws of Babylon, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the annals of war, they were now within reach, ready to reveal the intricate tapestry of human history that had been woven long before us. As the decades passed, the field of Assyriology, named after the ancient Assyrian Empire, flourished. Scholars traveled to the ancient sites, carefully brushing away centuries of debris, excavating layer by layer, and uncovering treasures that had been hidden for ages. It was as though the earth itself had been keeping its most precious secrets safe, and now it was ready to share them. The discovery of the royal libraries at Nineveh, for example, where thousands of clay tablets were found, illuminated the cultural richness of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. These tablets contained everything from royal decrees to myths, letters, and even mathematical texts. The civilizations of Mesopotamia, long thought of as mysterious and lost, now became some of the most well-understood of the ancient world. Archaeologists and historians also uncovered the grandeur of Mesopotamian architecture, immense ziggurats, the towering walls of Babylon, and the grand palaces of Assyria. These were not just structures of stone and brick, they were the physical manifestation of the dreams and desires of an entire civilization. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, once considered a myth, began to take shape in the imaginations of those who studied the remnants of this ancient wonder. They weren't just symbols of power, but expressions of the beauty and creativity that had flourished in a land that birthed some of humanity's first great ideas. But the discoveries did not stop at the physical world. With the unlocking of cuneiform, new insights into the intellectual and spiritual lives of the Mesopotamians began to unfold. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest works of literature, was not just a story of gods and kings, it was a reflection of humanity's deepest concerns: mortality, friendship, the search for meaning in a world full of suffering. These texts gave voice to the universal questions that still echo in our hearts today. The words of these ancient scribes transcended time, reminding us that the challenges, hopes, and dreams of people long gone are not so different from our own. The impact of these discoveries rippled far beyond academia. The ideas that were unearthed about law, governance, astronomy, mathematics, and literature shaped the way we understand the past and how we view ourselves in the present. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, offered a glimpse into one of the first systems of justice and law, a reminder that the pursuit of fairness and order was a cornerstone of society long before our own time. The mathematical achievements of the Babylonians, the astronomical knowledge of the Sumerians, and the artistic masterpieces of the Assyrians all spoke to a rich and complex world that laid the foundations for much of our own civilization. Today, as we look back at these discoveries, we can't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and awe. Mesopotamia, once thought to be lost to history, is now at the heart of our understanding of the ancient world. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia's wonders didn't just bring the past to life, it gave us the chance to reflect on our own journey. The lives of those who came before us, their triumphs and failures, their hopes and struggles, are now part of the great tapestry of human history. And as we continue to learn from their stories, we are reminded that the legacy of Mesopotamia is not just a relic of the past, but a living, breathing part of who we are today. The sun had long set on the towering ziggurats, and the echoes of Babylon's bustling streets had faded into the dust of history. Yet, the heartbeat of Mesopotamia continues to pulse through the ages, reverberating in the very foundations of the world we live in today. The cradle of civilization, as it is often called, was not just a place of grand cities and mighty empires, it was a forge where the ideas that would shape human progress were first hammered into being. The legacy of Mesopotamia is a silent and visible thread that connects us all, woven through the fabric of our lives in ways we may not even realize. When the first kings of Sumer etched their laws into clay, they set the foundation for what would become the rule of law, an idea that still governs the world today. In the sprawling libraries of Assyria, scribes meticulously recorded the world's knowledge, ensuring that it would be passed down to future generations. The achievements of Mesopotamia in law, science, and culture were not merely the accomplishments of a few, but the birth of the systems, knowledge, and beliefs that we take for granted. They gave us the wheel, mathematics, astronomy, writing, and so much more, gifts that ripple through time like ripples on the surface of a still lake. It is impossible to ignore how much of the world's current structure is built upon the bones of ancient Mesopotamia. Think of the vast empires that once spanned this fertile land: Babylon, Assyria, Persia, each one pushing the boundaries of governance, developing systems that balanced power and justice. The Code of Hammurabi, etched into stone over 3,500 years ago, laid out laws that addressed everything from trade to marriage, ensuring a sense of order. This was the first true system of governance that aimed for fairness, a model of law that we still try to perfect today. When we think about justice, we can trace its origins to those early tablets, those laws carved into stone by rulers who believed in their people's need for order. In the realm of science, the brilliance of Mesopotamia cannot be overstated. They charted the stars before we even thought to look to the heavens for answers. They knew how to measure the heavens, track the seasons, and even predict the movements of the planets. The Babylonians made astronomical calculations that would be admired for centuries, and the Sumerians invented the system of time we still use today. Our 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes are the legacy of a civilization that saw the heavens as a map to understanding the earth. Without these innovations, how much of the progress we enjoy today would have been possible? And yet, it wasn't only science and governance that flourished in Mesopotamia. Their culture, rich with myth and story, laid the foundations for literature itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever told, echoes across time, reminding us that the struggles of the human heart have not changed. Their hymns, prayers, and epics give us a window into a world where gods and kings walked among mortals, where love and loss were as real as the stones that built the ziggurats. The written word, the very thing that made these stories endure, was born here. Without it, we would have no Shakespeare, no Homer, no Tolstoy. We would not have the world of literature that has the power to move our hearts, just as the ancient Sumerians were moved by their own tales of creation and destruction. As much as the ancient world of Mesopotamia shaped us, the challenges of preserving that legacy are ever present. The dust of millennia is not easy to brush away, and time has a way of erasing what once stood tall. The cities that once boasted the wonders of the world are now buried beneath the sands, the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh crumbling into nothingness. Every year, the challenges to preserving Mesopotamian heritage grow more severe. The modern world, with its relentless march forward, often forgets the fragile beauty of these ancient treasures. Political unrest, climate change, and looting threaten the very remnants of the civilization that gave us our first steps toward the world we know. Yet, despite the ravages of time and war, the story of Mesopotamia refuses to fade completely. The clay tablets, the carvings, the ruins, they all tell a story of resilience. Just as the people of Mesopotamia once built their cities with hope, so too have modern archaeologists and scholars dedicated themselves to preserving that hope for future generations. The story of these ancient people, the legacy of their wisdom and innovation, is not a relic of the past, but a living testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. What is truly remarkable is how we still feel the weight of Mesopotamia's contributions in our daily lives. When we sit down to write, to record, or to read, we are engaging in an act that began on the clay tablets of Sumer. When we calculate the time, the hours, the days, we are following the path laid down by the Babylonians. When we strive for justice, when we seek fairness, we are standing on the shoulders of the kings and scribes who first sought to codify the rules that govern our lives. Even in the simple moments of our lives, when we look up at the stars, or when we fall in love, or when we face a trial, we are connected, through time, to those who lived in the heart of the ancient world. In the modern world, we may no longer walk the same streets as the ancient Assyrians, nor do we sit beneath the shadow of the towering ziggurats of Sumer. But the spirit of Mesopotamia is alive in us, and every building, every idea, and every law that governs the way we live. The struggle for justice, the pursuit of knowledge, the quest for understanding, the heart of Mesopotamia beats on, not in the ruins of a long-lost world, but in the lives of those who continue to build, to dream, and to create. So, as we look back at Mesopotamia's legacy, we do not merely gaze upon the past. We stand at the edge of an unbroken line, one that stretches from the first great cities of the ancient world to the world we inhabit today. The Mesopotamians gave us the first seeds of civilization, and now, it is up to us to nurture those seeds and pass them on, just as they did, to the generations yet to come.